Sir asked me to come in and talk to you guys, and one of the things I wanted to discuss was peace through policing. And the first thing that came to my mind was de-escalation. De-escalation is a hot topic right now. It is something that you'll hear on the news after every use of force encounter. And I hear a lot of things that people say regarding de-escalation and what that means. So I wanted to talk about that. I want to talk about peace, and I want to talk about mentorship and how mentoring works. And I think how all of this kind of works together, whether it's service, peace, or it's our de-escalation techniques, and how that all works together. The effort of law enforcement through the implication of assessment, tactics, and communication to resolve critical incidents with the least amount of force necessary. What does de-escalation not accomplish? And one of the main things, and actually this is listed as what we teach our recruits as well, is de-escalation is not police can talk our way out of using force. We can't or shouldn't use force anymore. Police can't or should never shoot anyone again. Unfortunately, that's just a part of our job line, our career. It's part of the description of what we do is law enforcement. Sometimes we have to do that. And that's nothing that anyone takes lightly. And that's something that we don't go into work every day thinking that we're going to do. So de-escalation is not those things. It is not a cure-all for all of life's problems that we see out on the street. And I wanted to have an opportunity to get in front of people and explain that aspect of de-escalation, because a lot of times I just hear that we can de-escalate our way out of problems, and I just want to make that kind of clear to people who aren't in law enforcement that this is not always the case. So then the other question is, well, what is de-escalation? What do we do, right? So de-escalation, again, builds us time. It allows us to use the least amount of force necessary to accomplish the goals. Of course, in most cases, is getting people in handcuffs, or in cases of critical incidents regarding mental health, which is a big one that's popped up, how you talk people down, and how we as officers go through that training, and what does that look like when we apply that training out on the street. What I'll say this is quickly is I think most senior officers who really think critically about this job, I think de-escalation as you go through your career is something that you have to do. You can't fight your way out of every problem. It's impossible. So I think as officers progress in this career, they learn those de-escalation techniques kind of on their own, sometimes the hard way, and sometimes through formal classes. And I think this is the new way, is having these formal classes where we discuss these topics. But I would say many of these topics are applied by good officers and have been applied by good officers for many years. So there are about 321 million people in America every year. And this, according to the Washington Post, every year there's about 63 million police encounters. Of those 63 million police encounters, we have 13 million arrests. Of those arrests, we have about 800, well, almost 900 uses of force. Uses of force meaning kind of different things depending on the department, where force was used to make the arrest. So about 900,000. And then of the 900,000 incidents where we use force, 1,000 result in death. And anytime somebody is killed while we're using force, it is a tragic thing, both for the victim, or the suspect, and the officer, because the officer has to carry that with him, carry that burden with him, regardless of whether it was justified or not. Just September of last year, one of my officers was involved in a shooting where he had to take somebody's life in a justified shooting. Luckily, that shooting was caught on body camera, or actually was caught on the DVR of the vehicle. And so the perception from the public was that it was a very fair shoot. So the media actually only carried it for about a day or two before they moved on to the next story. And that was great for him, but he's actually still under the process. He's still waiting, have his case sent to the grand jury. But the department is backing him 100%. We're very confident he's going to be just fine. In that incident, somebody used a fake gun. It looked like a real handgun to force us to use deadly force against him. On the flip side, that officer, he's forced to kind of deal with an incident like that, which takes a toll on you mentally. So that's one side of things, that where de-escalation in that sense just doesn't work. But we can teach de-escalation, I think, to younger officers. But again, I wanted to point out that a lot of those classes are very vague. They talk about really stress inoculation and things like that. And so, you can't always rely on that stuff because there's actually positives and negatives to all of that too. I do appreciate questions. So how do we feel about officers treated in our precinct? I think how officers are treated in Arlington. Arlington's pretty unique. We're a pretty big city in between two large cities. And I think if you asked me 10 years ago when I first started as a police officer, what the plan was to deal with protests, like Sarah was saying, I'm part of a heat unit. My heat unit's a very versatile unit. So we are the frontline responders when it comes to these protests. And I'm a supervisor in my unit. So I'm the one running the show a lot of the times for these protests. And so if you would have asked me 10 years ago, how do we deal with this? I would have said to squash the problem immediately. Anyone steps out of line, we put them in handcuffs and we move on, right? When you step onto the road and you block traffic, it's a Class B misdemeanor in the state of Texas. It's an arrestable offense. It could be a Class C depending on how you articulate it. But generally, it's an arrestable offense to stand in traffic and block it. So do we have the lawful authority to make those arrests during those protests? And does that work to de-escalate the problem? And I think the answer is no. The city of Arlington took a strategy of, well, we are not going to allow protesters to break things. We're not going to allow them to loot or riot. However, we will allow them to march, take over intersections, and assemble peacefully and then state their piece and move on. And I think that strategy has worked well because we don't force encounters, which sometimes some of the agitators, that's what they want. They want that forced encounter so they can put it on YouTube, and that's what we have, right? But what we do is we create a space, a safe space. We actually protect them with our traffic units, with my unit, and we protect them actually. And in one case, it was caught on live TV about 2 weeks ago, and I think live on Facebook Live, where a drunk driver almost hit him, and our units were there to actually stop that drunk driver from hitting the crowd that was in the middle of the intersection. As a supervisor, as I've seen the way this is played out, it's actually to our benefit to allow them, to give them the space to protest. And what it does for us in Arlington is it actually keeps us fairly safe. Those protesters, generally, they appreciate the ability to go out and state their piece wherever they want. And also, if they're looking for the agitators on that side of things, if they want a confrontation, they're not going to get it at Arlington. You're just not going to. You're not going to get it unless you break into a Walmart or you start looting and things like that. Then you'll get us to contact. But I think it's a great way that our department has chosen to de-escalate those types of protests where perhaps other departments have not. Peace is a large component of that. And when we talk about peace, especially when we're talking about protesting in 2020 and what that looks like with officers is whose peace are we talking about here? Is it the right for the person that just got off work that wants to take that road to go home? Is it the right of the protesters who are blocking that road to state their piece and say what they want to say? Are we talking about the suspects, right? Talking about police? It all depends, and I think it's a balance. And we as police, for better or for worse, we have to make those decisions. And so there's something interesting that I don't know that many people consider when you see these events on TV and what that means. Is it the stakeholders, is it the business owner? Because sometimes these large crowds, they park in a business. They'll take over that parking lot to assemble and to prepare their routes to protest. And so again, I mean, if the business owner says, I need those people off my property, well, in the state of Texas, they can do that. And we as police, we have to enforce the law, right? So what do we do? Do we kick them out of the parking lot? Do we work on it? How do we handle those situations? So
can you talk a bit about whether officers sometimes retreat or take evasive action from someone armed to avoid responding by shooting?
To answer that question is pretty difficult because I think it varies for each incident. The quick answer is, do we have to? And the answer is no, we don't have to. If we perceive a threat, whether it's a gun or a knife, then yeah, we can act on that threat. And is there a need to sometimes tactically retreat? And and from a SWAT standpoint, yeah, I mean, back, let's see, 2-3 months ago, we were working a call, mental disturbance. So this guy was having a mental issues. I don't really know what. He starts shooting a gun through his home. The rounds of this, it's a large rifle, was penetrating his home and entering into his neighbor's house. Very dangerous situation. There were 2 kids inside. By the time SWAT was called, we were paged out. We get there, long story short, we have the house surrounded. We've got everyone out safely except our main suspect, but he's still firing rounds, so we have to go get him. We have to get him the help that he needs because he still poses a very real threat. While we were on scene, we tried unsuccessfully to reach him. So we do is we try to get some sign of some movement. So what the officers were going to do was punch a hole in the glass of the house so that we could put gas inside. The gas makes it very uncomfortable, and hopefully the person comes out, surrenders to somebody on either our arrest team or a perimeter, and we can get them out into safety. So what happened was the team walks up to that window. The suspect immediately starts firing rounds through the window at officers, putting about 5 or 6 rounds. Well, the beauty of SWAT is that we have the equipment, the training, the patience, I think, more than most, to be able to step back and say, well, what just happened, assess what just happened, and then react to it. In this case, the suspect fired rounds into what we knew was a vacant house because we had cleared everybody out. And we were able to back out, retreat, and then we were able to use a different tactic to pump gas into the home. And then ultimately the suspect came out and surrendered. I mean, we pumped it just full of CS gas, and we were able to get him out. That is one example of being able to retreat when somebody's using force against you, but that takes a very experienced set of officers with the right equipment, such as shields. I think if you're talking about a one-on-one encounter with a suspect, and if you're by yourself, like I said, one-on-one on the street, it's very difficult to have that officer retreat, because what we've noticed as we train, having somebody walk backwards in a high stress situation is actually it's pretty dangerous, and it's pretty difficult to do for the officer. So there are a lot of things that we do. We train for distance, we train for cover, which buys us time to react. But I wouldn't say that retreating from somebody from a knife is always going to be the case, because it just simply it can't. And that's kind of one of those things we can't de-escalate. And actually, another instance, a suspect got out of his motorcycle. This is a well-known drug location. He was on a motorcycle. He evaded me on his motorcycle, went to his house. Well, actually went to a friend's house, got to his friend's house, drove up the driveway next to the front door. Very unusual. Most people, you guys get pulled over by the police. You pull over to the right side of the road. We make our contact and we move on, right? This guy, he continued, drove home for about 2 blocks, drove up his driveway right next to the front door where there was a guy waiting for him at the door. When I approached, the guy said, "Hey, what are you doing on my property?" The driver of the motorcycle said, "I didn't do anything wrong." And I began to pull him away from the house, and that was to create some space. Again, that space gives us time. This is time to react, to de-escalate what's happening. So immediately I pulled the suspect back down towards the front curtilage or the sidewalk area of the house, and then the suspect began to fight. So then it was like a one-on-one fight for about a minute. Luckily, the other guy never came down to help him. He just stayed there, and I was able to put him in handcuffs once backup arrived. I knew right away what I was seeing. I was seeing somebody that was trying to stall, trying to delay. Ultimately, yeah, he had some methamphetamine on him and a knife on him, and that's why he was so scared at the time. Well, the training center got a hold of that. The training center said, we can't de-escalate every problem. Sure, you can. I mean, if our safety is at risk. So if I would have tried to explain to this guy, hey, the reason why I pulled you over is because your motorcycle hasn't been registered in 2 years and you have no driver's license and you have no insurance. Meanwhile, this other guy is standing 6 feet behind me. That's not a really safe environment. So that's one of those instances where de-escalation just doesn't apply. It doesn't work. And I kind of wanted to contrast those two incidents. So I appreciate the question. So kind of moving through is in the other topic I wanted to talk about. So not only de-escalation, because I think all this kind of works together, because anytime you can make an arrest on somebody and not have to use a lot of force, it's a win-win. So what are the ways that we do that is through engaging in the community too, and using them as an avenue to help kind of show our legitimacy as police officers and our want and desire to make a difference in the community. So my group, Amigos, we do some mentorship. But when we talk about mentorship, it can be expensive. I mean, you guys will probably all know that when you guys set up a camp, I know you guys set that Ryla camp, right? So when you guys set that camp up, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of energy. So what you'll see in policing, and at least with our organization, is you'll see these really, really good programs come, and they're great. First 2 years, they're fantastic. The person doing them is putting a lot of energy into them. The problem that we run into as police officers is we can't sustain those programs. We just simply can't, because what happens, that person moves, they promote. We don't have a full-time person responsible for those programs. And so they get lost into the wind, and then we don't really know what happens to them, but the relationships are still there. So one example is we have the Mentoring Arlington Youth Program. You'll hear it touted about in Arlington quite a bit. It's a great program. It just, the reality is that we don't have a one person who can manage and run those programs. And they kind of fall to the wayside. So I think that's, as police, that's something we can work on to do better at in how we mentor, because sustainability is a big issue. And with that comes money. I mean, it does take time, it takes money. And when we talk, we can keep going down this rabbit hole where we talk about defunding police. Well, and that's all well and good. And I'm sure there's some things that we don't want to do as police that we have to do. But part of that, and those things that are going to be cut, are those hours used for community events, for those mentoring relationships. So that's something to consider when we think about those topics of defunding police and what that looks like and what that actually means. I saw the first question, it was unconscious bias. The second one I didn't see just yet, but I'll come back to it. I'm sure Sarah will read it for me. But yeah, so we do have to take a 4-hour unconscious bias training class. And what I'll say is, I think unconscious bias is difficult to understand, really. I mean, if you articulate what it means, it's a bias that you have that you don't know you have. So really what it boils down to is how we treat people. We had the same sort of program when we had you had like it's LGBTQ type training stuff too. I would say it's very similar. At the end of the day, you just treat people fairly, with respect, and you'll do just fine. If you're fair to everybody, you treat everyone as the same, as you respect people, I think it's a big one. You're always gonna come out on top as a police officer, and as long as you're not doing anything more different than you normally would, and it's a good, then you're probably doing the right thing. If you're not changing how you're doing it, you're just being fair to everybody, then you're doing okay. One of the things I've seen, coming through here is a lot of friends from college. I've seen like 2 or 3 in the drunk tank before. So I think to myself, okay, how would I want my friends to be treated in a situation where they come into contact with Arlington police and they're arrested? And the answer is simple. I want them to be treated fairly, like adults, like human beings. And I want them to treat them with respect and fairness. And then that's simply all we can ask for. And as far as unconscious bias specifically, I took that class a couple of years ago, and I can't tell you anything specific that I learned from it or I took away from it, other than, we just treat everyone with respect. Kind of going through, as I've gone through my career, I found that listening is one of the major things, and showing empathy is one of the 2 major things that we could do as police officers. Because what people forget is that we're human beings, and if I'm working a 10-hour shift, it's a busy day, I had to skip lunch, I'm hungry, I'm tired, and I roll up to the next call and I'm just rude or short, that nobody cares that I didn't eat lunch, right? You guys don't know. Your emergency is the emergency that you're having when I'm talking to you at this moment, right? So that's something to consider. And actually, one of the classes I teach is professional policing. It's one of the first classes we teach recruits. And one of the main things I teach them is that on a major accident, when you see 2 cars collide and you're about to deal with somebody from one of those accidents, your first question should always be, are you okay? It's, are you okay? And I think we sometimes as police, we lose that because, like I was saying before, we're tired, we're hungry. This is maybe our 3rd accident of the day that we have to work. We hate doing accidents. We're tired of it. It's annoying. Why don't you slow down? It's raining, something to that effect. And I train them that, having empathy and really showing that by asking those questions, are you okay, as your first line of questioning, is always going to help you out. Even when I do investigations, a lot of what I do is marking out people on bicycles, And a lot of times what I'll do is the first things I'll ask, are you okay? Are you hot? You know, it's 100 degrees out here. What are you doing out here riding a bike? And that's how I start my introduction, to show that empathy to people regardless of who they are.
So as citizens, if we feel uncomfortable in a police encounter, what are our rights for defending ourselves? I don't mean physically, disengaging, or helping to de-escalate the situation from the other side.
Yeah, so, you know, one of the great things to come recently, and I'll be honest, I wasn't a huge fan at first, was a body camera, right? In Arlington, we wear a body camera. We're required to have it. It's in our uniform. It sits in my pocket. You can actually kind of barely see it. It's a hole in Arlington. It's a hole in our uniform with a lens coming out of it. So one of the great things to come out are those body cameras, right? So as a supervisor, if you call me and you say, you know what, Sergeant Rosado, your officer, when he pulled me over, was a jerk and he was rude, well, I could pull that camera up and I could show you exactly what maybe I can't show you literally, but I can see exactly how that encounter went. So it goes twofold. And what I'll say honestly, in most situations, those cameras have vindicated the officer more than it's vilified him or her. So body cameras are great. They record the encounter as it's happening. They don't record every aspect of the encounter. As far as what your rights are, it depends on the situation. I don't know, you know, each situation is different. What I will say is if you're lawfully detained, it's a good idea just to cooperate. You don't have to talk. I consult a lawyer. I think there's a couple of lawyers on here right now, but simply put, if you're detained and you're lawfully detained, to de-escalate, the easiest thing to do is just to stay quiet. If you have an issue, you can, you know, sometimes it's just, there's really nothing you can do except to go back to that body camera and say, you know what, I want to file a complaint. Here's my issue. Here's a body camera. Or you can ask to speak to a supervisor at that time. I've had people do that before too, where they feel like they're not being heard. And I'll tell you this, actually, as a supervisor, 9 times out of 10, if I'm dealing with a complaint, it's usually that the person just wants to be heard. I resolve most of my officer complaints 9 out of 10 by just listening to somebody on the phone, and not necessarily conceding that my officers were wrong, because sometimes they're just not. Sometimes it's the suspect's mom. I've had one recently where it was the mother of a suspect who he stole his mom's car, went out, bought pot with it at a house, and then went into high-speed pursuit with officers, and the mom was mad at us like it was our fault, right? It's not our fault your son was smoking pot at a dope house. It wasn't our fault that he decided to get into a high-speed pursuit with officers. He didn't have a driver's license, right? But the mom was upset on how we handled it. But when I spoke to her, it was almost like she was just scared. I mean, her son was just arrested. He was just involved in a high-speed pursuit with officers. Her car was impounded. And so, you know, she was very upset in a lot of those things. We just handle it by listening. Going back to, you know, specifically, you know, what are your rights? Again, I would consult a lawyer because everything's a little bit different. But what I'll tell you is if you are detained and you're lawfully detained, your best weapon are those body cameras and filing those reports. And I'll say with a department like Arlington, a department like Fort Worth, yeah, we're big, but we do a pretty good job of policing ourselves. Most of our complaints on officers are actually internal, believe it or not. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but I'd say about, I had the numbers just last week, and I don't want to lie to you guys, but it's something like 70% of complaints against officers are internally driven. They're not externally driven.
Obviously, the George Floyd situation is at the forefront of everyone's mind these days when it comes to community relationships with the police. What kind of policies or procedures does your department have in place to address bad apples or people who have questionable records?
Yeah, so when the George Floyd thing first came out, one of the issues that I discussed that I've seen in policing is how do we get rid of bad cops? They exist, right? I think it depends on the region. Up north, there are very strong police unions that protect officers from complaints. They exist. Down here in the South in Texas, they have what's called civil service. Civil service is a title that's used to hire cops, and it's used to protect them as well. What our specific policies are, it's not clear because we treat everything independently. But what I'll say is we in Arlington are not civil service. So we use a mediator to run our discipline. So for instance, actually, we just fired a guy today. Now that officer, once he's fired, has the ability to, because he's fired by a chief at a chief level, he can appeal it to our number one chief, the number one chief role. After that, the chief upholds that. He can go to a third-party mediator, and the third-party mediator can either uphold that termination or they can reverse it. And that's how we do it in Arlington. I have criticized before our unions across the nation on how they protect bad cops. I've criticized our own police, one of our other police associations, for protecting bad cops. I think if there's some room for criticism in policing, I think it's those police unions that work really, really hard to protect really bad cops that don't need to be there. Kind of similar to how we have those really strong teacher unions who protect bad teachers that probably shouldn't be there. We all know who they are. We all know who those cops are. They shouldn't be there, but they're still there. What I'll say in Arlington, at least, the guy that I'm thinking of that still works there, he wasn't bad in the sense that he was using excessive force consistently or like that. He just really made really dumb decisions, bad choices, but apparently nothing's risen to the level that he should be terminated. My opinion of that is if you're making those many mistakes and they lead to suspensions and you're being suspended like once a year, then you probably should find a new career or something else to do. And I wish there was a way to better terminate those guys, but it's tough because on the other end of it, we had a guy who was terminated, I thought, unfairly, or he used a sick day when he shouldn't have. He had a very clean record as far as discipline goes, and he was terminated for that, when I feel like the suspension and something like that would probably be more in line with what we do. So it is twofold, but I think there is room for improvement on that front as far as getting rid of bad cops, because I think that is a problem. It definitely is a problem. I think the question that I saw was what our policy is on no-knock warrants. The policy just came down from the chief, our interim chief, last month, that we will no longer do no-knock warrants by default, and that if we want to do a no-knock warrant, we have to have an approval by an assistant chief, which is a pretty high rank. So that's how we've changed our no-knock warrant recently. Coming from the SWAT perspective, what I can say is that we've really, as we've gotten on, we've really changed our tactics and how we do things. So when I'm sure, I recently joined the SWAT team about 2 years ago. Years ago, dynamic entry, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with what that means, is when you enter a home and you just start filling up rooms and taking control over the house. I think that's what most people think of when they think of SWAT, and when SWAT hits a house. That was actually fairly commonplace, and they would do that with almost anything, which is, thinking today, in today's terms, it's wild. It's a kind of a wild notion for SWAT teams to be kicking down doors and filling every room, right? It's pretty dangerous. So the purpose of no-knock warrants typically is evidence protection. So what you'll find is, okay, you'll have a detective and a narcotics unit say, hey, I think this guy's dealing a lot of dope. They've made dirty stops out of the house, meaning that they've arrested people leaving the house with drugs. And so what the detectives will do is they'll say, yep, this house has got three dirty stops from this house. We've done some surveillance. They're all known users. And they'll issue a no-knock warrant for that house to try to recover the dope inside the house, which I think is inherently very dangerous. And I'm a new team leader on the team. I'm probably one of the more modern voices as far as I don't like doing dynamic entry on narcotics warrants. I think those that's pretty antiquated. That's old school, and it's very dangerous because you run the risk of those lethal force encounters. It becomes the danger becomes exponential when you enter a home like that for any reason. And so what we need to do is cops is just do a better job. If your issue is I need narcotics out of this house and you're really worried about them flushing it down the toilet, getting rid of it, then we need to be more creative and think of other ways. So the new standard in SWAT, and I think we're in Arlington, we're slowly moving that direction, and that's good to see. But the new standard is to actually do what's called a breach and announce, or knock and announce. So we'll knock on the door, announce our presence, surround the house, and utilize other tactics like gas to get people to come to us where it's safer. Come out of the house to us where it's safer. Then we can enter with technology first, so robots or drones, and then put bodies in there once we do it. And that's the ideal way. So yeah, no knock warrants. We can't do them anymore, but they didn't say no, we can't forever, but it's one of those things where you have to have permission from a chief to be able to do that. And I think, kind of even aside from that, I think as policing, we're slowly moving away from that tactic.
You say modern voice. I'm seeing this in all kinds of fields. Is there a big generational divide in perspectives? And do you see things changing for better or worse as a result of those perspectives?
Definitely for the better. Yeah. So when I say modern voice, the thing is that the people that are leading this department, and most police departments probably have 25, 30 years of experience in those roles. Well, this job 10 years ago, now policing is policing regardless of where you go and in whatever generation, but how you do the job has changed. You can't do even what I used to do 10 years ago today. When we were trained, it was ask, make, tell. That simple. Hey, you, can you sit down? No. Sit down? No. And then you'd make them sit down, right? That's exactly how I was trained 10 years ago. Today, we don't do that unless there's like an immediate need to put somebody on the ground, which sometimes there are. We don't do that anymore. I'm not saying that we'll sit and have negotiations for hours, but we simply don't do that anymore. And I think that's one of the ways that this job has changed, as well as these cameras have really changed. It's made us more professional, I think, and it's made the public more aware. How to change that? I don't know. I think that's just putting more people into leadership roles. I think we all know as humans, change is always something that we are not very fond of humans. We like the stability and we like doing things the way we've always done them, right? So it's very difficult. If I tell you that a SWAT team who has been working together since 2010, and I come in as the new guy 10 years later and say, hey, wait a minute, I went to this national conference and other departments aren't doing it the way we're doing it. We're doing it this way. Now, I have some say because I have a leadership role, but I will say that the change for the guys that are coming up, it's not easy, and so it takes time, and I think that's true across the board with most every profession.
Our last question for you is: unfortunately, there are police departments that have a history of corruption. What are some ways we can help our communities understand that police are not all corrupt and that they are there to help?
Oh, that's tough, right? Because I think the onus is on the department as well. So we have what's called a consent decree. The DOJ can put your department under a consent decree and essentially run your department. I think there's 11 nationwide right now, including Puerto Rico and New Orleans and Seattle, I believe is even one of them, where the federal government comes in and says, you guys aren't responsible enough to run your department, so we'll run it for you. And it costs the city a lot of money. I think minimum is about $2 million annually to have your department under a consent decree. How do we do that? It's tough. I mean, when you talk about funding, and I hate bringing this up, in Arlington, we require officers to come in with a college degree, right? College degrees don't make you a better officer, but they make you, studies have shown that you use less force if you've got a college degree. Why that is, a lot of it, we think it's culture. You're exposed to more cultures when you're in college. You're able to mature a little bit differently when you're in college. So maybe upping the standards for policing, but also upping the funding, right? So when we talk about defunding, what scares me the most about defunding police departments is now all of a sudden, if you're cutting pay, well, you get what you paid for, right? So a lot of we recruit our officers because we say, hey, look, we appreciate that you went to college. We're going to pay you like you're working a profession, right? I think this the part, like policing as a whole has come across as a very blue collar sort of job. But as we've gone through these past 25, 30 years, we've really begun to professionalize this job. I think we need to work more to doing that. We need to really work towards doing that. And so by perhaps upping our standards, increasing pay for police to make this a profession, to make these officers professionals, is a great start. That's why when I hear defunding the police, it makes me really nervous, because then training, it comes out of that. I mean, our training budget in Arlington for officers is extinguished. When I'm talking about training, I'm talking about external training. We're gone by Q1. So after our first fiscal quarter, we're done. There's no more. So for 3 quarters of the year, we don't have any money for training. And that's a problem. So we really need to increase those standards. I think as a community is come together and say, okay, what do we want? How do we envision policing, and make sure that we keep our standards high. And when we keep our standards high, we're going to keep the pay high. It's not going to be a cheap thing, but the more I think you guys, and I say you guys as stakeholders, the more as stakeholders puts into police, the more I think you can demand of police. So if you say, you know what, we're going to increase y'all's pay, but we're also going to say, you know what, these bad officers over here, we can't keep doing that. We have to find a way to get them out of there. I think that's one way to do it. But I think it's very tough. I think when you burn your reputation by being a bad police department, that's not good. It sucks. And it's very difficult to get that trust back. That's why my group, Amigos in Israel, we work really hard in our community to show that we are human, that we're officers, we're here to help, and we put ourselves out there a lot. And I think when you saw the protest over George Floyd, those protests, what you saw in Arlington was a very watered down version of what you got nationwide. And I think that's a testament to the officers on the street in Arlington who really work hard on that community policing, and we put a lot of responsibility on those officers to make sure that they are living up to those goals and values. And that's ultimately what I think makes the difference here in Arlington. That's why I'm proud to work here. So it's up to each department to decide, and the citizens of those departments to decide what they want the departments to look like. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Alex. This was a very good Q&A. I know you had some slides, but